My name is Eliza Vance. I'm 34 years old, and while I was 5 hours away in Raleigh on a business trip, my own parents broke into my home to steal my 10-year-old daughter's 1923 Heinrich Müller antique cello, a masterpiece that my grandmother once played at Carnegie Hall, and sold it to a dealer for a mere $17,000 just to fund a luxury heated swimming pool in my younger sister's backyard. I am a senior litigation paralegal who spent a decade building a life out of the scraps my family left me, only to realize that the people who gave me life were the same ones waiting for the right moment to hollow it out. This wasn't a crime of necessity or a desperate move to keep a roof over our heads. It was a calculated, cold-blooded liquidation of my daughter's heritage to fund a summer of status for my younger sister, Sloan Miller. My 91-year-old grandmother, Adeline Whitlock, gave that instrument to my daughter with a notarized gift letter and a legacy attached. But my father saw it as nothing more than a dormant asset sitting in a crammed two-bedroom walk-up in Dilworth. He used his professional skills as a retired site supervisor to change the deadbolt on my daughter's bedroom door, making sure I couldn't even see the empty space where her soul used to live, until he was ready to tell me that the music was over. I remember thinking that morning in Raleigh that the hardest part of the month was already behind us, that the property dispute I was handling was the only mess I'd have to clean up before I could get back to the quiet rhythm of our life. I honestly believed that as long as I kept my head down and worked my billable hours, the world would let us be. You know, I've been carrying this part of the story for a while now, and telling it out loud still makes the air feel a little thin. It's a warm feeling to know I'm not just speaking into a vacuum, but that there are people like you listening from all over the country today. Leave your city and state in the comments. I always love knowing where people are listening from. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because the moment I stepped back into my apartment in Charlotte, I knew the structural integrity of my life had been compromised. I had spent the drive home thinking about the dinner I would make for my daughter, Maya Vance, when she got back from music camp the next day. Her favorite pasta with the extra garlic she loves. The car ride was quiet, and the sun was setting behind the Charlotte skyline in a way that made everything look peaceful and settled, like the world was finally in order. I truly believed that when I opened that door, I would find the same home I had left behind 4 days ago. But the air in our Dilworth apartment felt clinical and cold the moment I stepped through the door that Thursday evening. A heavy, silent warning that someone had been moving through my private spaces while I was 5 hours north. I walked straight to my daughter's room, my heart still lit with the thought of her coming home the next day. But my key wouldn't even slide into the lock. My father, Harrison Vance, had replaced the old brass hardware with a brand new, brushed nickel deadbolt, a professional finish that stood there like a signature on a document I never signed. It was a clean, surgical installation that told me he hadn't just visited. He had taken possession. I had to call the building manager to let me into my own daughter's space, and when the door finally swung open, the sight of the cello case leaning at that hollow, weightless angle made my stomach drop into a void. I knelt on the floor and unzipped the velvet lining to find nothing but a ghost shape where 90 years of history used to rest, a vacuum of sound that felt like a physical blow to the chest. I called my mother, Martha Vance, and her voice was, and filled with that she uses whenever she's about to gaslight me into believing my own pain is an inconvenience to her. She told me that my father had simply taken the instrument in for maintenance, that they wanted it to be a surprise for the recital. But when I demanded the name of the shop, her story began to fray at the edges like cheap fabric. When I finally got my father on the phone, he didn't even try to hide the theft. He spoke with of a man who had already decided that he was the hero of this story. He told me that the cello was a family asset, stored in a building he oversaw, and that he had sold it to a dealer named Crown City Vintage Instruments for $17,000 because my sister needed that pool for her boys. He said it was for the bigger picture, for the family wellness, as if my daughter's future was just a line item he could cross out to balance the books of my sister's social standing in Lake Norman. I stood there in the center of that empty room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and I realized that the man who had raised me saw my daughter's soul as nothing more than liquid capital. He had taken a masterpiece that my grandmother had played in New York in 1958, an instrument that had survived 2 marriages and a cross-country move, all to dig a hole in the ground in a gated community cul-de-sac. The betrayal didn't just feel like a loss of property. It felt like he had reached into my daughter's chest and stolen the one thing that made her feel like she belonged to something larger than herself. I looked at the empty space on the floor where the amber varnish usually caught the light, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the difficult daughter they always accused me of being. I felt like a litigation professional who was looking at a crime scene. The sound of that apartment is what I miss the most when I close my eyes at night. A specific resonance that didn't come from the humming refrigerator or the distant sound of traffic on East Boulevard, but from the soul of the building itself. Every afternoon around 4:15, my daughter would sit by the window in her bedroom where the late summer light hit the floorboards at a sharp, golden angle, and she would pull the 1923 Heinrich Müller from its case with a reverence that most children reserve for a prayer. The cello was German-made, with a delicate hairline crack across the top plate that had been restored sometime in the 60s, leaving a faint, silver-gray line that looked like a scar that had healed perfectly clean. It had a voice that my grandmother used to describe as dark chocolate and old velvet, rich, deep, and slightly melancholic. The kind of sound that felt like it was vibrating in your own marrow instead of just passing through the air. If you ran your fingertip along the amber varnish, you could feel the history of every concert hall it had ever been in, a physical record of survival that had been passed from my grandmother's hands into my daughter's like a sacred secret. It was the only thing in our 2-bedroom walk-up that didn't feel temporary, the only object we owned that hadn't been purchased at a clearance sale or salvaged from a consignment shop in South End. I spent my evenings in the kitchen, listening to the scales rising through the hallway and trying to convince myself that this small, beautiful sound was enough to drown out the noise of a life built on compromises. I think most of us know that feeling. The way you hold on to one tiny piece of perfection because you're terrified that if you let it go, you'll have to admit the rest of your world is just a series of things you've learned to tolerate. And I think many people who are listening right now have been there too. That quiet moment at the kitchen table where you realize you're the only one keeping the foundation from crumbling while everyone else is busy picking at the bricks. My grandmother, Adeline Whitlock, had played that instrument at Carnegie Hall when the world was a different place, and she had carried it through 2 marriages and the kind of hardships that either break a person or turn them into flint. She was the one who taught my daughter that music isn't about the notes, but about the memory of the wood. A lesson that my father could never understand because he only knew how to measure the value of a thing by the price someone else was willing to pay for it. Honestly, the way my family spoke about that instrument still sits heavy in my stomach, like a meal that won't go down. You've been around long enough to know when someone you love crosses a line that can never be uncrossed, and it makes you wonder if you ever really knew them at all. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were sitting where I was sitting that night? And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because the look on my daughter's face when she finally came home from camp, that was the moment the peace died for good. The memory of my grandmother is inseparable from the scent of rosin and the stiff academic discipline of a woman who had spent 5 decades as a conservatory dean. At 91, she still sat with a posture that could silence a room, her eyes sharp and unblinking behind her glasses as she watched my daughter play. She had given the cello to her when she turned 7, following her very first recital, and I remember the way the room went silent when she handed over the case. She had prepared a notarized gift letter even then, a document I had scanned into my digital drive and tucked away, thinking it was just the lingering habit of a woman who had lived through the Great Depression and learned never to trust a verbal promise. I realize now that she was the only person in the Vance family who saw the world for exactly what it was. A place where even your own blood will find a way to justify taking what isn't theirs if you don't have the paperwork to stop them. My parents always treated our Sunday dinners like a performance, a carefully choreographed play where my mother, Martha Vance, played the role of the sacrificing matriarch for an audience of none. She would refill glasses and smile for the photos, while my father sat at the head of the table like it was a throne he had earned through sheer suburban dominance in Myers Park. My sister, Sloane Miller, would show up late with her twins, letting them run through the house like small tornadoes, while she complained about the North Carolina heat and the embarrassment of not having a private pool in a neighborhood where everyone else was already swimming. I remember sitting there, watching my daughter sit in a rusted metal folding chair they kept in the garage because they only had 6 real seats at the dining table. I had asked twice for a real chair for my child, but my mother would just sigh and tell me not to be difficult, as if wanting my daughter to be treated like a human being was a personal attack on the family peace. That was the tax I paid for years, the difficult daughter tax that required me to stay silent while my father talked about his construction projects and my sister scrolled through Instagram filters. I had been paying that tax since I was 17, when I got accepted to Duke University with a partial scholarship and a heart full of pride. My father had sat me down at that same mahogany table and told me that the college fund was going to be reserved for my sister because she was the one who needed the extra help. He said I was smart enough to figure it out on my own, a sentence of financial excommunication that forced me to work 2 jobs for 4 years while living on instant noodles and sheer spite. I paid off my student loans over 9 grueling years, while my sister dropped out of community college after 1 semester and used her portion of the fund for a Cabo San Lucas honeymoon and a 5-tier wedding cake. I had learned to live with the inequality, to swallow the bitterness, so my daughter could have a relationship with her grandparents. But I didn't realize that by keeping the peace, I was just feeding a monster that was eventually going to come for the only thing my daughter truly loved. I stood there in that empty room thinking about the morning I left for my business trip to Raleigh, how my mother had hugged me and told me to have a safe drive while the key to my apartment was already heavy in her pocket. She looked me in the eye and told me that everything would be exactly where I left it, a promise that was already a lie before the words had even left her mouth. I trusted her because I wanted to believe that there was a bottom to their greed, a limit to how much they would take from me before they felt satisfied. I honestly believed she was just at home, worrying about what to make for dinner, rather than coordinating a heist that would hollow out my daughter's future. I remember thinking, as long as I work my billable hours and keep my head down, we will be fine. I didn't know that back in Charlotte, my own father was already using a heavy-duty dolly to wheel 90 years of Maya's soul out of our front door. I drove to my sister's house in Cornelius without calling ahead, and I saw the betrayal before I even put the car in park. The heat at Lake Norman that Friday afternoon was a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to trap the scent of damp mulch and diesel fuel in the air, a thick atmospheric warning that I was walking into a place where the rules of family no longer applied. I turned onto her street, a pristine cul-de-sac of multi-million-dollar homes where every lawn is a perfect, synthetic shade of emerald, and I saw the yellow arm of the excavator before I even shifted the car into park. It was clawing into the earth with a rhythmic, mechanical violence, tearing a 6-foot-deep trench into the backyard of the house my sister and her husband, Brooks Miller, had bought with a predatory car loan and a mountain of credit card debt. She had texted me the morning before I flew to Raleigh, asking for the recipe for a lemon garlic chicken I usually made for the boys, her tone light and familiar, as if we were just two normal siblings sharing a life. I remember feeling a small, quiet surge of warmth when I replied, thinking that maybe the friction of the last few months was finally smoothing over into something like peace. I honestly believed she was just at home, worrying about what to make for dinner, rather than coordinating a heist that would hollow out my daughter's future. I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching the Lake Norman Pools crew lay down the rebar, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My daughter's soul had been traded for a hole in the ground and the promise of a better social standing in Mecklenburg County. My sister, Sloan Miller, was leaning against the white picket fence with her phone held at a high angle, carefully framing a selfie that captured the construction in the background, while filtering out the raw, ugly reality of the mud. She looked up at me with that practiced, Caldwell smile, the one she uses to mask the fact that she has never carried the weight of her own choices, and spoke about how our parents had decided to give the boys an early birthday gift. She described the $100,000 project as if it were a simple, well-deserved luxury, completely oblivious, or perhaps intentionally indifferent, to the fact that the $17,000 my father had handed her was the literal price of Maya's heritage. I stood there looking at her, and I kept waiting for her to stop, for some flicker of shame to cross her face. But she just went back to her screen, already picking out the perfect caption for her pool life reveal. Honestly, standing there watching her take that photo while my daughter's heart was breaking 5 miles away, it's a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to realize you were just a supporting character in their story? I'm curious what you would have said to her in that moment. Drop it in the comments. I really want to know. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because when I finally got my father on the phone from that driveway, the conversation took a turn that I never saw coming. When I finally reached my father, Harrison Vance, on the phone, the conversation was a masterclass in the kind of irrationality that destroys the safety of a home. He didn't deny the sale. He simply reframed it as a management decision for the Vance family, speaking with the flat, bored tone of a man who believed that being the head of the household gave him the right to liquidate anything he saw as a dormant asset. He actually told me that a 1923 Heinrich Müller antique cello was just an old piece of wood taking up space in a crammed bedroom in Dilworth, whereas a luxury swimming pool was a way to build lasting memories for the grandchildren who actually showed potential. It was the ultimate betrayal of the American ideal of family protection. The man who was supposed to be the guardian of our legacy had become the one who sold it to the highest bidder to fund a summer of status. "You need to understand the bigger picture, Eliza," he said, and I could hear the heavy, vibrating bass of his voice that usually signaled I was supposed to shut up and accept the injustice. "That instrument was sitting there gathering dust while your sister's boys were cooped up in the house with nothing to do. We made a choice that benefits the entire family, not just one child's hobby. You should be thanking us for thinking about the boys' wellness instead of making this into a legal drama." I stood in my sister's driveway, listening to the roar of the diesel engine and the sound of my own heart breaking. And I realized that to my parents, my daughter and I were just line items he could cross out to balance the books of my sister's social standing. I stood there thinking, she knows exactly what she did, and she's waiting for me to be the one to apologize for making it awkward. I looked at the raw earth of the pool trench, and I felt a quiet, clinical shift in my mind. The kind of cold clarity that only comes when you realize the person who raised you is actually your greatest threat. He told me to calm down and reminded me who paid the property taxes on our apartment, a threat he had used for years to keep me obedient. He told me that my grandmother was 91 and wouldn't remember the notarized gift letter she had signed 3 years ago. He thought he was untouchable behind the shield of family loyalty. But he forgot that I have spent my entire adult life reading the fine print that men like him ignore. The realization that my own father was willing to gamble with Maya's future for a backyard upgrade was a weight I wasn't prepared to carry. It wasn't just about the money or the instrument anymore. It was about the fact that they had looked at a 10-year-old girl and decided her dreams were a fair price for a social media post. I drove away from that Lake Norman house with a stillness in my chest that I had never felt before. A cold, sharp resolve that replaced the decades of trying to be the reasonable daughter. I was no longer interested in maintaining the peace of a family that was more than happy to let me drown. I was going home to find the one thing they didn't think I had, the evidence that would prove they never owned the ground they were standing on. The apartment felt different that night, a heavy, airless kind of quiet that seemed to vibrate with the absence of the music that usually filled the corners of our 2-bedroom walk-up. I sat at the small kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, the blue light of my laptop screen casting long, clinical shadows against the pale gray walls of the dining nook. My daughter was finally asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic in the next room. But I knew she was dreaming of the silence where her 1923 Heinrich Müller used to be. I remember thinking as I watched the cursor blink on the Mecklenburg County record site that I had spent 34 years playing the role of the reasonable daughter, the one who smoothed over the cracks in the foundation, while my sister and my parents treated our lives like a demolition site. I think most of us know that feeling. When you've spent your entire life being told that you're the one who has to be mature, because everyone else in the family is too busy being a disaster to bother with the truth. It's a quiet, exhausting weight that you carry until the moment you realize that being reasonable is just another word for letting people walk all over you without making a sound. Honestly, this is the part of the story that still sits with me. The moment where the silence in that kitchen felt heavier than any noise my father could ever make. Has someone ever taken something precious from you? Something they had no right to touch, and then looked you in the eye and told you it was for your own good? You don't have to share the whole story right now, but please, just leave a heart below in the comments if you've been there, so I know I'm not alone in this. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because what I found in those digital records at 3 in the morning didn't just save my home, it dismantled my father's entire kingdom. My mother, Martha Vance, had called me that afternoon just to ask if I needed her to pick up some organic groceries for the apartment. Her voice the same as it always was, warm and unhurried, like there was nothing in the world she wouldn't do to make our lives easier. I told her I was fine and thanked her for thinking of us, genuinely believing for a moment that the tension of the last few days was just a fever dream we could wake up from. I think she already knew that by the time I arrived at the house for the family meeting, I'd be walking into a trap that she had spent the last 48 hours helping to set. The house in Myers Park smelled of pot roast and expensive floor wax, the kind of domestic scent that usually signals a safe harbor, but felt like a suffocating blanket as I stepped into the foyer. My father, Harrison Vance, sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, his presence filling the room with the heavy, vibrating authority of a man who had spent 40 years giving orders and expecting them to be followed without question. My mother was beside him, smoothing out a linen napkin with a rhythmic, nervous motion that she used to signal to everyone in the room that she was the one suffering the most. My sister, Sloane Miller, sat across from them, her jaw set in that sharp, defensive line she always wears when she's about to play the victim, while her husband, Brooks Miller, a man who worked in luxury car sales and always smelled too strongly of expensive cologne, hovered by the sideboard. He was the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room. He occupied it, acting as an amplifier for my father's worst instincts, nodding in agreement before my father had even finished a sentence. I didn't sit down. I stood by the door, refusing to enter the circle they had drawn around the table, and I watched as my father opened with what he clearly considered his closing statement. He spoke about the greater good of the Vance family, about how Maya's cello was a dormant asset that had been liquidated to provide a lasting memory for my sister's boys in the form of that luxury pool. He actually used the word fairness, claiming that because I lived in a family-owned apartment for a reduced rent, it was only right that my daughter's inheritance be used to balance the scales for my sister. I stood there thinking, my sister actually believes this. She actually thinks my daughter's soul is a fair price for a patio upgrade and a higher social standing in Charlotte. You have to look at the bigger picture, Eliza, my father said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous bass that had kept me obedient for 34 years. That instrument was sitting in a room gathering dust, while your sister's boys were looking at the neighbor's yard through a fence. We made a decision that benefits everyone. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're not the mature person we thought you were. I stood there thinking, I am watching the man who raised me justify grand larceny with the tone of a man who just decided what color to paint the garage. Then came the threat that was supposed to silence me forever, the one my father had kept in his pocket like a concealed weapon for years. He told me that if I mentioned a lawyer or a police report one more time, he would call a locksmith and have the deadbolt on our apartment changed by Monday morning. He reminded me that he was the one who paid the property taxes and the insurance on that building, and that if I chose to be ungrateful, I could find out exactly how much that cello was worth while my daughter and I were sleeping in the back of my 10-year-old SUV. He wasn't just defending his theft. He was willing to make his own grandchild homeless to protect a $17,000 lie. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't flinch. I thought about the document I had found in the Mecklenburg County records, the one that proved the house he was sitting in didn't even belong to him. For 25 years, he had told the neighbors in Myers Park that he was the master of his domain, that he had built his legacy through grit and construction savvy. I remember sitting there in the dark earlier that night, my fingers hovering over the trackpad, and I felt a strange, cold surge of adrenaline as the PDF for the warranty deed finally loaded. I didn't find my father's name. I didn't find my mother's name either. What I found was a document dated 1992, transferring the property into the Whitlock Family Trust, with my grandmother, Adeline Whitlock, listed as the sole trustee. He wasn't the owner. He was a guest who had forgotten that his invitation was never a permanent title. I turned and walked out of the room without saying another word, leaving them to their roast and their lies, knowing that by the time they finished their dinner, the world they had built on my silence was already starting to crumble. I drove back to my small walk-up in Dilworth, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, and I didn't let a single tear fall, because the time for being the difficult daughter who eventually caves to maintain the peace was finally over. The city of Charlotte was a blur of street lamps and brake lights, but inside the car, it was perfectly still. The kind of heavy, clinical silence that only comes when you realize the people who raised you are actually the greatest threat to your future. I thought about the way my father had walked through the halls of that house on Birchwood Lane for 25 years, like a king who had personally laid every brick, and I felt a strange, cold surge of adrenaline, realizing his entire authority was nothing more than a legal fiction. He had used that house as a weapon for as long as I could remember, holding the threat of homelessness over my head whenever I dared to question why my sister was always the one who got the college fund or the private music lessons. I think most of us have a threshold we don't know exists. A point where the weight of being the responsible one finally snaps the structural integrity of our own patience, and you realize that your loyalty is being used as a tool for your own destruction. It's a quiet, exhausting weight that you carry until the moment you realize that being reasonable is just another word for letting people walk all over you without making a sound. And I was finally done being the bridge that everyone else in the family used to cross over into their own comfort. I sat at my kitchen table, the only light in the apartment coming from the blue glow of my laptop and the flickering street lamp on East Boulevard, and I started to do what I have been trained to do for a decade as a senior litigation paralegal. I stopped looking for an apology, and I started looking for the paperwork. Because my father assumed that entitlement didn't need to check the title report, but paralegals always do. I called my best friend and colleague, Sonia Brooks, a family law paralegal who had seen the worst of what people do to each other when they share a last name, and she picked up on the second ring with a voice that was a steady, grounding presence in the middle of my panic. I told her about the warranty deed, about the Whitlock Family Trust, and about the $17,000 my father had pocketed from the sale of the cello to fund a Lake Norman swimming pool. I remember her silence on the other end of the line. the kind of professional pause that tells you that you finally found the crack in the wall. And she told me that if my grandmother hadn't signed off on that sale as the trustee, then what my father had done wasn't just a family dispute. It was grand larceny. She reminded me that in North Carolina, the law doesn't care about family wellness or the bigger picture when it comes to the conversion of trust assets, and that it was time to stop being the glue and start being the evidence. I thought back to my grandmother, Adeline Whitlock, sitting in her bungalow in Myers Park, surrounded by the programs from Carnegie Hall and the ghosts of her own legendary career as a concertmaster. She had always been the quietest person in the room, a woman who didn't need to shout because she knew exactly where the power was kept. And when she had given that cello to my daughter 3 years ago, she hadn't just handed over an instrument. She had handed over a future that she had specifically protected with a notarized gift letter, a document she prepared because she was a woman who had lived through the Great Depression and learned that family loyalty is a beautiful thing until someone decides that your dreams are worth less than their backyard luxury. I realized then that she was the only person in the Vance family who saw the world for exactly what it was, a place where even your own blood will find a way to justify taking what isn't theirs if you don't have the notary seal to stop them. I've told this to a few people in my life, and the reaction is always the same, a mix of shock and that quiet realization that family can be the most dangerous place of all. If you were in my exact position, knowing that taking action meant removing your own parents from the home they'd lived in for decades, what would you do? Leave a yes or no in the comments. I genuinely want to know if you'd pull that trigger or walk away to keep the peace. And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because the decision I made next was the hardest one of my life, and it changed everything that came after. I sat there as the first light of dawn began to touch the rooftops of the Charlotte skyline, watching the rain beat against the window like a series of small, transparent marks. And I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a litigation professional who had just found the smoking gun in a property dispute. And I knew that once I made the next move, there would be no going back to the table on Birchwood Lane. The peace would be gone. The Vance name would be dragged through the mud of a public record. And I would finally have to face the fact that my parents were not the people I had spent 34 years trying to love. I was ready to call the lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne who had handled my grandmother's affairs for 20 years. And I was ready to see what happens when the king realizes he's just a squatter in a house built by the woman he underestimated. I looked at my daughter, Maya, sleeping in the next room, and I thought about the 1923 Heinrich Müller, the dark, rich sound of the wood that my father had dismissed as a dormant asset. And I realized that I wasn't just fighting for an instrument. I was fighting for the right to exist in a world where my daughter's soul wasn't for sale, and where the people who were supposed to protect us couldn't just liquidate our history to buy a summer of status. My father thought he could bully me because he assumed I had nowhere else to go. But he forgot that I am a woman who knows how to read a title report, and that entitlement doesn't check the fine print, but paralegals always do. I closed my laptop, walked into the kitchen to pour out the cold coffee, and for the first time in months, I felt a stillness in my chest that wasn't born of fear, but of a cold, quiet certainty that the music was going to start again, whether my parents liked the tune or not. I didn't go to sleep that night. I sat in the stillness of our Dilworth apartment and watched the rain begin to bead against the window like a series of small, transparent marks, each one a tiny distortion of the Charlotte skyline. I remember thinking about the morning I had left for my trip to Raleigh, how my mother had hugged me and told me to have a safe drive, while the key to my apartment was already heavy in her pocket. She had made me a travel thermos of coffee, the same way she always did, and the liquid was warm and familiar, tasting of the kind of home I thought I still had. There were no ominous shadows then, no flickering lights to warn me that the woman who raised me was about to unlock my daughter's door and let the thieves in. I honestly believed I was safe, and that belief is the hardest thing to lose when you realize the people you trusted most were just waiting for you to look away. I drove to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department at 7 in the morning, the air in the Queen City smelling of wet pavement and burnt coffee as the early commuters began to fill the streets. I didn't just bring a statement. I brought a folder of certified documents, notarized letters, and the printed email chain that proved my sister's role as the mastermind behind the entire heist. I handed the folder to an Officer Miller, a man with a tired, clinical face who didn't blink when I told him the suspects were my own parents. He looked at the wire transfer confirmation for $17,000, the pittance my father had accepted for a masterpiece valued at over $100,000. And he told me that in the state of North Carolina, this was felony larceny. He handed me a card with a case number on the back, a small piece of cardstock that felt like a conclusive end to the family I had tried so hard to preserve. An hour later, I was in a sandstone building downtown, sitting in the office of Marcus Thorne, the trust and estate attorney who had managed my grandmother's affairs since before I was born. I watched as my grandmother, Adeline Whitlock, arrived in a black town car, looking like she was ready to chair a board meeting at the symphony. At 91, she still possessed a quiet authority that didn't need to shout to be heard, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her eyes as sharp as a metronome. I told her everything: the empty cello case, the pool trench in Lake Norman, the threat of eviction from my father, and the email I had found. My grandmother didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her hands folded over the head of her mahogany cane, until I was finished. Then she turned to her attorney and told him to prepare the papers, her voice as level as a tuning fork. I remember standing there thinking, if I sign these, if we send these letters, there is no going back to the dinner table on Birchwood Lane. I stood there thinking, I am choosing the legal ink over the blood, the justice for my daughter over the comfort of my parents who never once considered ours. I felt a strange, cold stillness in my chest as the printer began to whir, producing the 2 envelopes that would dismantle my father's entire reality. One was a demand letter for the full market value of the instrument, $107,000, and the other was a 30-day notice to vacate. My grandmother picked up the pen and signed each document with a hand that was old but steady. A final verdict delivered from a woman who had spent 5 decades conducting an orchestra. She looked at me and told me that sometimes you have to clear the dead wood so the forest can grow. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a guardian. Before I had left the apartment that morning, I had navigated to the shared family email account, a relic of a time when my parents thought they needed a joint space for utility bills and Costco coupons. and I found that my father had never bothered to change the password. I scrolled through the inbox, past the receipts for home improvement supplies and the newsletters for luxury car enthusiasts, until I found a thread buried under a folder of spam. It was dated September 3rd, 2 full days before I had even boarded the flight to Raleigh, and the subject line was simply a string of dollar signs. I remember my hands starting to shake as I read the words from my sister, Sloan Miller, to my mother, detailing the exact quote from a dealer at Crown City Vintage Instruments. My sister wasn't just a passive recipient of a gift. She was the architect of the entire heist. A woman who had calculated the value of my daughter's heritage and decided it was the perfect down payment for her swimming pool. She had told my mother to handle me, to make sure I was distracted or out of the house when the heavy-duty dolly arrived to take the instrument away. I stood there thinking, I have spent my entire life trying to be the bridge between these people, and all the while, they were busy measuring the wood to see how much of a fire they could build with it. The betrayal wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a coordinated effort to strip my daughter of her future so they could have a summer of status. My sister had even joked in the email about how Maya could just play the ukulele because it was cheaper and took up less room in our cramped apartment. That was the moment any lingering hesitation I had about the police report vanished into the cold air of the kitchen. We sent the envelopes via USPS certified mail, the return receipt requested, and I spent the rest of the day in a state of clinical detachment, watching the tracking numbers on my phone. My parents were still basking in the glow of the Lake Norman Pools installation, thinking they had successfully bullied me into a permanent silence with their threats of lock changes. They had no idea that the post office was currently carrying 2 small, white, precision-guided notices toward their front door in Myers Park. I sat in my small apartment that evening and watched my daughter, Maya, practice on her hollow-sounding borrowed cello, the scratchy notes filling the room with a persistence that made me want to cry. I didn't tell her about the letters or the felony charges yet. I just told her that the music was coming back, and for the first time in weeks, she actually believed me. I remember thinking, the man who taught me how to ride a bike is the same man who would rather see his granddaughter homeless than admit he stole from her. It's a strange thing to realize that the people who gave you your first home are the ones you have to protect your own home from. But as a senior litigation paralegal, I knew that the law doesn't care about sentiment. It only cares about title. My father thought his construction superintendent background gave him the authority to decide who owned what. But he was about to find out that a notarized gift letter from a concertmaster carries more weight than all the brushed nickel deadbolts in North Carolina. I stood by the window and watched the rain wash the dust off the street, waiting for the green delivery confirmation to pop up on my screen. The letters hit the house on Birchwood Lane at exactly 3:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, a moment of legal reckoning that arrived in a simple white envelope with a green certified mail sticker. I wasn't there to see the color drain from my father's face, but my friend, Sonia Brooks, happened to be driving past the Myers Park neighborhood and saw the fallout from the sidewalk. She told me that Harrison Vance stood by the mailbox for a long time, the paper fluttering in the late October breeze like a wounded bird, while my mother, Martha Vance, watched from the front porch with her hands pressed against her mouth. They had spent 25 years assuming that the ground beneath their feet was a gift they had given themselves. But the paperwork from Marcus Thorne was a cold reminder that entitlement doesn't hold a title deed. My father called me 20 minutes later, his voice stripped of the commanding, vibrating bass that had always been his greatest weapon, replaced by a high, terrified tremor that sounded like a man realizing the trap door he had been standing on was finally swinging open. He tried to tell me that my grandmother, Adeline Whitlock, was confused, that I was manipulating a 91-year-old woman into destroying her own blood. But I simply listened to the silence on the other end of the line. I remember thinking, he still thinks he can bully the truth into changing its shape, as if the notarized gift letter and the trust schedule were just suggestions he could ignore. My sister, Sloan Miller, didn't even call. She was too busy watching the walls of her own social standing crumble in Lake Norman as the Lake Norman Pools contractor stopped work on the half-finished concrete trench. The $17,000 my father had pocketed was already gone, swallowed up by a $3,000 retainer for a real estate litigator and the mounting debts of my sister's lifestyle. They had set fire to our history to buy a summer of status, and now they were realizing that the smoke was going to follow them for the rest of their lives. I've been sitting here thinking about how quickly a lifetime of trust can evaporate once the law finally gets involved. Before I tell you what happened to him, what does justice look like to you in a situation like this? Drop it in the comments. Then, after you hear what actually happened, tell me, was it enough? And please take a second to press the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. What came next was something even the attorney said he had not seen in 20 years of practice. The hearing in the Mecklenburg County Circuit Court took place on a crisp morning when the air in Charlotte smelled of falling leaves and wood smoke. My father wore a blazer that didn't quite fit his slumped shoulders, looking like a man who had finally realized that his reputation was a legal fiction. The judge, a woman who had seen 1,000 families tear themselves apart over a will or a deed, didn't even look up from the evidence I had provided in the receipts folder. She saw the wire transfer, the Instagram post where my sister called a masterpiece a pool life accessory, and the email where Sloan had architected the heist while I was in Raleigh. The Vance name was read into the public record not as a pillar of the community, but as a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. The court ordered Harrison and Martha Vance to pay $107,000 in restitution to the Whitlock Family Trust for the conversion of the instrument. A structured repayment plan was established through immediate wage garnishment, and the 30-day notice to vacate the family residence was upheld without a single day of extension. My parents were forced to pack their lives into cardboard boxes and move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Gastonia with thin walls and a view of a parking lot, paying a monthly rent that was more than they had paid in 25 years of living for free. I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's Myers Park bungalow a week later, watching as my daughter, Maya Vance, knelt beside the mahogany conference table where the Heinrich Muller was waiting. I had spent 34 years waiting for my father to love me enough to be honest, but I realized then that I was the only one who could give myself permission to be free. It wasn't my silence that kept the family together, but my fear of being the one to finally turn on the lights. I still drive past the old house on Birchwood Lane sometimes, and I keep going.